The Benjamin Dixon Show is only possible with listener support. Go to www.thebenjamindixonshow.com to register for our blog and join the Progressive Army. And now, ladies and gentlemen,
You're now about to witness the truth.
It's the Benjamin Dixon Show.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the Benjamin Dixon Show. I am, of course, your host, Benjamin Dixon. It is Thursday, April 13th, 2017. Thanks so much for joining us. As always, I'd like to start by thanking our supporters, without whom we cannot do this. So a special thanks to our latest patrons, Darian W. Thank you for becoming a patron. Thaddeus H. Thank you for becoming a patron. James Q. Thank you for becoming a patron. And Robert B. Thank you all for becoming a patron in the midst of the YouTube apocalypse. They have still not return monetization to the same levels, so we are like everyone else. We're getting hit pretty draconian in a draconian fashion. But special thanks to Secular Talk, Kyle from over at Secular Talk, for promoting our link as well. We got a couple of patrons from his channel, so thanks so much for the cross independent media support. We really do appreciate it. The phone lines will be open later on in the show, 857-600-0518. I will be talking with a professor of political science from Boston College, Lindsey O'Rourke. She focuses on, obviously, political science, but her specialty is regime change. And I think that's an important conversation for us to have in light of everything happening in Syria, potentially happening in North Korea, and all of the issues happening on the international stage. So we'll be discussing that with her as soon as we get a chance to cover some of the news, some of the breaking news. The first thing I want to talk about is four videos of police brutality that, well, you know what? Instead of me describing it, it's probably best that I just go ahead and share it. So let's play the first video. This first video is out of Georgia. Let's take a look at it. And you can barely hear in the background, but if you're listening via the radio, you see the officer. It's just a 10-second video. And in context, for those who are listening on the radio audience, the officer pulls the gentleman out. He has his hands up. And even in the midst of his hands being up, the officer hits him in the face. Now, there's a second video to this that shows what happens afterwards. Immediately after this, the officer subdues him. He puts him in handcuffs, has him face down on the ground. And a second officer comes onto the scene and he does this. Let's watch the second video. You see, he's handcuffed. The officer stepped away, and he's radioing someone. Here comes another officer and stomps the man's head in the ground. You know, what's sad about it is that we can actually do an episode of This Week in Police Violence, because this is just two videos of the same incident. There's an investigation underway in Georgia over the officer in this case. But now here's another video of a man jaywalking. This is from Sacramento, California. Let's take a look at this incident. And you see the gentleman, he's trying to walk across the street, starts to have a conversation with the police officer, and you can tell the conversation starts to get escalated or heated. But then the officer does this.
Everybody, this is right here in the Del Paso Heights. Nephew, just listen. I want to move. No, you got to stay right here. You can't. Hey, why you doing him like that? Wait, Alexis. Hey, Alexis, why are you right here, Naomi? Get out. Oh my God. You can't be handcuffed like that. Hey, why
And you can see the police officer is still stomping him.
Oh my God. Oh my God.
Now.
Oh my God. He beat him like that.
Yeah.
Oh, Jesus.
So.
This,
yeah, that's good. I've seen enough. So with this video, I was a little hesitant about this video until I read the story. The reason I was hesitant about this video is because the man in the video, the black man in the video, takes off his jacket and has a very strong stance against this police officer. And to me, that, you know, if you know you're dealing with a lion or a tiger, not to describe them in a positive way in this case, right? If you're dealing with someone who is hostile, the last thing that you want to do is square up with them. But this is what the guy does. But as I read the story, obviously everything that happens after that is completely beyond the pale. They charged him with resisting arrest. Those charges have been dropped. There's been a criminal investigation into the police officer involved in this. And this is all happening just this week alone. And what's crazy is in video one, you have a man with his hands up getting assaulted by the police officer. Video two, the gentleman's hands weren't up. He did have a strong stance against the officer, but he gets assaulted. And it's like, your hands up or not having your hands up, you get assaulted. Here's a third video. All of this happened just this week. Let's take a look at it.
I'm mad. They videotaping you, sir. I mean, I see why are you being aggressive, sir? Look, I am, sir.
This guy is cooperating, and here comes the officer, kicks him, stomps him in the head. This is a second example of a police officer who detained the suspect, has handcuffs on him, and a second officer comes into the scene and literally kicks the man in the head. If you saw pictures of this last video of the guy's mugshot, you'll see his nose is busted, his mouth is busted. This one actually took place in Columbus, Ohio, and the officer's name is Zachary Rosen. He is under investigation in this. He's been placed on leave, and if you recognize the name Zachary Rosen, this officer just got off of a grand jury investigation. They decided not to press charges in last year's shooting death of another black man, Henry Green. So here's the officer who just, by the skin of his teeth, didn't get charged with murder or manslaughter in another case, comes into the scene where the black man is already under arrest, face down on the ground, handcuffed, and kicks him in the head without any reason, just comes straight onto the scene and kicks him in the head. This is just this week in police brutality. I haven't done many of these videos in a long while because we've been covering the election, we've been covering Donald Trump, we've been covering Syria, but this many incidents jumping out and slapping you in the face in just 1 week, it just goes to show you that to say we have more work to do is an understatement. Right? That's the understatement of the century. But to say that we have concerns here domestically that we absolutely must address with people living in fear of police officers who will come on the scene unprovoked, unnecessarily so, assault a person who is in handcuffs. In these cases, all of them have been placed under investigation or they have been placed on leave. But we've seen this time and time again. The question is, will they be charged and will it actually go to trial? If it goes to trial, as in the case in North Carolina with Walter Scott, will they be able to get a conviction? We still haven't seen that happen in quite some time. What's your take? 857-600-0518. That's what's happening domestically. Let's jump to a little bit of international news before we go to our guest and talk about regime change. Chechnya. We reported this about 2 weeks ago during a protest. There was a mass arrest of about 100 gay men in Chechnya, 3 of whom were killed. As a result of those arrests, many of the people who were arrested, some have now escaped. And I want you to hear my language very precisely. They escaped from conditions that are now being described as concentration camps for gay men. This is happening as we speak. There have been over 30 messages of concern from people who have escaped to international advocacy officers describing their conditions as being men placed in rooms with 15 to 30 prisoners. They're held without food. They've been tortured with electric shocks. They've been beaten. Some of them have been beaten to death. And there seems to be little of no recourse with Russia. Russia says that they have not heard about this, and if there are any complaints, that they should file a complaint. Meanwhile, people who are escaping from these detention centers, whatever you want the precise language to call it, I don't know, but people who have escaped are describing these situations in Chechnya that people are considering to be a style of concentration camp. Now, here's what disturbs me the most about this story, besides the obvious assault on human rights. What bothers me about the story is the language that's coming out of Chechnya with regard to this. One of the spokespersons for the leader of Chechnya said this. They said that it's not possible for these events to be taking place because there are no gay people in the republic. I mean, I don't even know really what to say to that, except perhaps that's the best evidence that we have of the human rights violations that are occurring at this point. This is happening essentially in Russia's backyard. This is something that if they're aware of, that they do have a responsibility to address. But Russia is not a panacea for LGBTQ rights. Perhaps comparatively speaking to Chechnya, maybe you can consider it to be a better situation. But the image that's behind me right now is an image of Vladimir Putin that has been banned in Russia. And you also have to remember the legislation that they passed not too long ago that banned what they considered to be the promulgation of gay propaganda to minors. So it's a situation that's ongoing. There's still people who are missing out of those 100 men that were detained, and they're not even admitting that it exists, that it's happening at all, because they don't have gay people in Chechnya. This goes to show you the conservative leanings, the ideological religious leanings of the region. It's so embedded in their culture that they even consider it mercy killings or honor killings to kill someone who is gay. Families that fall apart, they fall apart if they find out that someone is gay. It's so entrenched in the ideology, the religious culture there, that they won't even admit that it exists. Yet reports are coming out that of the 100 people that were arrested, many of them are being held in conditions that some are calling or describing as concentration camps for gay men. All right, let's do a hard shift here. I want to, since we're on the international stories, there's a lot happening in the news. We covered a lot today when I covered for David Pakman, and I actually want to spend a lot of time on the next topic with our guest Lindsey O'Rourke from Boston College. The issue of regime change. It's something that I have intentionally, personally avoided online, just because it requires a robust conversation. It's not really a conversation that you can do in 140 characters. And so before I even begin, I want to thank Lindsey. Thank you so much for joining me in studio.
Thank you very much for having me.
I believe you may be just our second guest in studio, so it's a privilege to have you here. You're from Boston College. You studied at the University of Chicago.
That's correct.
And your background is in international relations, international security, foreign policy, and you specialize in regime change.
That's correct.
Tell us a little bit, before we get into it, tell us a little bit about your research in regime change.
Okay. Well, it came out of my graduate research at the University of Chicago in 2007. I was fishing around for a dissertation idea, and it was the height of the Iraq War. Everybody was talking about regime change. And I noticed that there were all these theories about regime change, and they were focused primarily on overt cases, wars and so forth. But I kept on thinking of these covert cases that I knew that contradicted these theories, like the U.S. intervention in Iran in 1953, Guatemala in 1954, and so forth. And so I decided what I wanted to do was to look at the covert instances of regime change. And when I turned there, I found that there hadn't been much research there. There had been some people looking at individual cases, and there had been a lot of conspiracy theorists, a lot of stuff on the internet sort of alleging that the CIA was intervening everywhere in the world. And so my goal was to try and come up with a representative sample of all the covert regime change attempts by the United States. And to do that...
Before you keep going, lean in a little bit more for me.
Okay, sorry.
Yeah, that's going to help my audience a little bit better.
Okay, sorry about that.
No problem.
And to investigate the covert regime change attempts, I did a lot of research at the National Archives and National Security Archives, several presidential libraries, and came up with a data set of all the times that the U.S. covertly intervened to overthrow the government of another country during the Cold War, which was 66 times.
Okay, do you know, that was going to be my next question. How many times have we, 66 times, we've attempted to overthrow a regime, or institute regime change covertly?
40 of those failed, and 26 of them actually brought the U.S.-backed government to power.
Okay, so let's talk about your definition of failing. I think you actually just gave it, and a successful regime change in your studies is one that brings a U.S. Friendly regime into power.
Yes.
And then out of the 66, 40 of them absolutely failed.
Yes, we backed somebody, but they weren't able to overthrow the government.
Okay. Well, so let's dig in there. And I guess, there's so many places to start. Let's start with the low-hanging fruit. Why, in your research, have you found in those 66 cases, did you find any consistent theme as to why we wanted regime change?
I think the overarching theme was that states intervened to protect their national security interests. And I came up with a typology of three main interests. The first were offensive operations, where you're trying to overthrow a current military adversary.
Okay.
So the U.S. intervening directly against Soviet allies in Eastern Europe would be an example of that. A second group are what I call preventive interventions. And here, you're intervening in a state that's not yet an adversary, but they're going to take some action that could make them a military threat in the future.
Okay.
Like allying with your rival or developing nuclear weapons. And so you intervene to ensure that a government is put in charge who won't take that action.
Okay.
And then the third group is what I call hegemonic operations.
Yeah.
And these are operations in the Western Hemisphere where the United States was trying to install a government who would be sort of sympathetic to having a U.S.-led order. And I argue that even though there was 18 hegemonic operations during the Cold War, they actually pursue a goal that predates and survives the Cold War, which is, the U.S. being a regional hegemon in the West.
So from my perspective, all of that makes sense. I could see in instances of each of those where someone in some room thinks that this is going to be in our best interest.
Yeah.
What have you found that in terms of already you give us the numbers? There's 40 instances that it failed, but even with those that failed, does it really work out in the interest of the United States? Yeah.
Both failed and successful operations have bad repercussions for the intervening state. For the interventions that fail, where you are backing somebody and they're not able to overthrow the government, they tend to have pretty bad influences on the target state. They're more likely to experience civil war. They're more likely to have mass killings. They're also more likely to sour relations with the target government. You already were on bad enough terms that you're trying to overthrow them, and now things are getting much worse. But even more surprisingly, even when you're actually able to succeed and install a government that you hope will act as your puppet and, act in American interest, I find out that it doesn't work out as American policymakers expect. And the reason why is that if you look at the subset of cases where states pursue regime change, it's normally a very weak state against the United States. And the government that you're trying to overthrow was unwilling to cooperate with the U.S. in the first place,
Right.
Even though they knew that doing so meant that they would be,
At the
probably
mercy of the
overthrown.
United States.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the reason why they did that is that they must have had really compelling reasons to maintain their beliefs. Either they had domestic support demanding that they do so, or their, geopolitical environment necessitated that they did. And so if you look at these states, you replace that government with a new puppet. That puppet might promise to be
Good.
always acting in the U.S. interest.
Yeah.
Exactly. But once in power, they realize that they face the same political constraints as their predecessor. And they're in this catch-22 position. Either they do the bidding of the United States, in which case they're bound to get a lot of domestic unrest, or they, turn against the United States and act in the interest of their domestic audiences. And I find that, the only leaders who are willing to act as puppets for the United States for long are those who are really dependent on the U.S. to maintain their position in power.
Okay.
And so it's a limited number of people who will do that. Those leaders tend to create a lot of domestic resentment, and then oftentimes they're overthrown. In fact, more than half of them are overthrown.
So the more dependent they are on the United States, the more likely they are to do the bidding of the United States in the long run, even to the detriment of their domestic position, political position. So let's jump up to 30,000 feet real quick. If you're able to find this with your research, and it sounds like overwhelmingly regime change is either unsuccessful, or even in the cases when it is successful, they are constrained by their internal politics that ends up getting the same result that they would have gotten from the previous regime.
Yeah.
If we know this, why the hell do we keep trying?
That's a very good question. I think it's just because the logic of regime change is so appealing. The idea that you can just go in, take out one leader, install somebody who promises they'll be your puppet, it seems like this permanent solution to the problem.
Right.
Rather than having to continuously coerce that state into doing your bidding, it's a one-time thing. You replace the leadership. The problem is it just doesn't work. Part of the reason why policymakers continue to do so many of the covert interventions is just that maybe they weren't aware of all the cases.
Yeah.
A lot of the times.
That's the worst excuse ever.
Yeah.
Like, you're a policymaker, you should know the history of all of these attempted regime changes that sometimes, had so much blowback that we're still dealing with it now.
Yeah, absolutely.
Wow. Okay. So let me ask another set of questions here. We talked a little bit before the show. And actually, I was really fascinated with your perspective on Russia's interference in our election, because you view it from a regime change kind of perspective. That's your field. And one of the things that you said that really stood out to me is that, similar to how foreign nations that we intervene in, we put someone in there that we believe is going to be in our best interest. They end up being constrained by their own internal politics, and they end up doing exactly what the previous administration would have done. You say similarly, if we look at all the allegations of interference from Russia, and let's view it through the lens of regime change, they got in Donald Trump, but this week we've seen Donald Trump doing the exact same things. Not even what President Obama would have done. He's doing the exact things that Hillary Clinton was going to do. So from that perspective, you feel that Donald Trump is, and this is more of a question now, do you feel that our internal politics are constraining Donald Trump on foreign policy for him to give a deliverable to Vladimir Putin that is not what Putin would have wanted if he actually colluded with them?
Yeah, I think that is accurate. You see both in Europe in terms of NATO, Trump reversing his position where he had been questioning the importance of the alliance, whether he would actually come to the aid of U.S. allies in the Baltic should Russia invade. And now he's reversed course. In Syria, he had talked about backing off regime change for Assad, actually working with Russia. And again, after the chemical weapon attack, he felt domestic pressure to act, and that's forcing him to turn against Russia.
And that's been one of my big things over the last week has been, it was last Thursday that he actually struck. I've been trying to figure out what in the world happened to Donald Trump between, I get the missile strike, I get the heartstrings, and legitimate heartstrings. I'm not downplaying the imagery that's coming out of it, but Donald Trump was very loud about not interfering. I mean, for every instance of his intervening at this point, we can find a paper trail, a tweet trail of all the times he decried, he fought against regime change. And I'm trying to figure out why he changed. Our hypothesis around here in the Twitterverse is really that Ivanka Trump has a lot more sway on her father than she probably should. But I do love your perspective in that he's dealing with the same internal pressures, the same domestic politics. He's dealing with the same, you can call it the deep state. I like to call it bureaucratic culture that pre-existed him and probably is going to exist beyond him. He's dealing with all of those constraints. And so it's very likely that he's simply doing what any other actor would have done in that role.
Yeah, I think that's accurate.
Wow. So what then and we'll get back to regime change because you have an article that I believe is coming out soon that I want to discuss specifically about Syria. But what about these internal forces compel regimes, whether it be the United States, whether it be Syria, whether it be any other nation that we've intervened in, compels them to act in the same fashion as the previous administration or the one that we replaced?
Well, one is the domestic pressures.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, if they change position from what the majority of the population wants. They're going to face either in democracies being voted out of office or in most of these cases, it's dictatorships, and they're going to face revolution or being violently overthrown. In fact, 50% of the leaders installed in U.S. covert regime change were actually later violently overthrown.
Wow.
It's kind of remarkable. And then the second factor is just the geopolitical environment that they are in. They still face the same threats. They still face, the same political pressures as their successors. So, for instance, some people had argued that regime change in Iran is a good idea. You could install somebody who wouldn't want to get nuclear weapons. My argument in that case is whoever takes power would have the same exact incentive to want nuclear weapons as their predecessor. And so it's unlikely to have very much impact on their foreign policy.
So if we stretch that out to what's going on in North Korea, ideas of regime change there have been floated, probably have plans on the books for likely every country in the world. But you're saying the same pressures that are on the regime currently they don't disappear. They don't change with the administration. Why the folly then? Why the expectation from people who've been around long enough to see the failure of regime change? Let's take leaders like Lindsey Graham and John McCain, who are just, they're chomping at the bit to institute regime change in Syria. Why? It's not fair to ask you this, but why do they not get it? Like, what about this regime change idea, besides just the logical, it seems logical, it's tempting, but it undermines us in a very significant way. Why would they continue to try it? Is it a firm belief in regime change? Have you found any examples of alternative or reasons that regime change is pushed, even if it's not for a successful regime change?
Oh, why they would want regime change? Part of it would be just to weaken a rival. I think rival states, whether you actually succeed or fail in overthrowing the regime, for instance, like supporting the Free Syrian Army against Assad, it still raises the cost for Assad either way, ties him down.
Okay.
So that could be one reason. Another reason why I think with Lindsey Graham and John McCain in particular is that it's not just regime change that they're talking about. It's often democratizing regime change. And I think they have a deeply felt belief that, there's sort of a universal liberalism, that everybody is a Democrat in waiting. Exactly. Yeah. And all you have to do is take out the leader and they would, behave as nice liberal Democrats and elect a government that will cooperate with the United States.
Contrary to all of the evidence, and with the side effects or the collateral damage of all the internal instability that it creates, all of the dead bodies that it leaves in its wake, they still believe in this idea. Let's shift to Syria, because you've done some extensive research or study into the problem of, or the potential of, regime change in Syria. And I don't know if I have the title correct, but is it the folly of
the fool's errand?
A fool's errand.
Yeah.
And tell me about that article and your thesis there.
Well, we look at the history of regime change in Syria. It's not actually the first time that we tried to overthrow a regime.
Right.
We did back in the 50s, but then the intervention since Obama. And my co-author and I, Alex Downs, we argue that it's not a good idea for several reasons. One of them being that we don't have a good idea of who we're backing. We think we're backing the Free Syrian Army, these moderate rebels. In reality, they're a very diverse group. Some of them are sympathetic to the U.S., many of them aren't. And in practice, when we've armed these people, many of them have split off. There's at one point in 2013 when a full quarter of them split off and joined al-Nusra and al-Qaeda, al-Fidayv. And so that's one problem. We don't have a clear, obviously pro-American group to support. Secondly, we don't have a good idea of what would happen if Assad did fall. Obviously, there's no one actor who could easily take over and run the state. There would likely be a second civil war, and in that case, you would likely see a potential ethnic cleansing of the Alawite population that has been aligned with Assad, potentially a genocide against them, continuous infighting. And so we just don't see an exit strategy. We know there's a very poor historical record of this type of intervention succeeding. For instance, in the Cold War, on 36 occasions, we did this. We backed an armed rebel group in their bids to try and overthrow a state, and only 5 times did it succeed. And in only one of those cases, which is probably the closest analogy, would be the U.S. supporting the Mujahideen in Afghanistan in the 1980s.
Right.
And if you look at that, one, it was hugely expensive,
Right.
$6 billion at the time, took a decade of commitment. And two, obviously, you know about the blowback from
Right.
that intervention. And so there's just no good strategy moving forward.
I hate to be redundant, but why? I mean, we know these things. I mean, this is common knowledge. This is everything that you're saying. I've, obviously haven't read your article yet, but anyone who's paid attention to the issues, you see this consistent theme of failed regime change, and yet there's a consistent attempt on the part of the United States to institute regime change. But let's go a little bit deeper into Syria. And perhaps this may be out of your purview. Just let me know if you don't want to discuss this. But if we don't institute regime change, what do? We just leave Assad there? Do we just let him continue to do and be who he is?
Yeah, there's no good options in Syria. That's the problem. Every single path that you can see move forward has huge downsides. I personally, I've thought about this a lot, and I go back and forth trying to come up with a good strategy. I think we need to focus on what American interests are in Syria, which is to minimize the humanitarian disaster and to make sure that the conflict stays localized. And towards that end, I think what we're doing now is probably the best bet. Some boots on the ground, the airstrikes, working with Iraq to fight it against ISIS in Mosul. But I think there's a lot more we could be doing to help on the humanitarian end. We could be giving more humanitarian aid, helping with the refugee crises, accepting more in the United States.
In the United States, yeah.
One of the things I found ironic about President Trump launching the missile attack after the chemical weapon attack by Assad was that he said that he was motivated for humanitarian reasons,
Right.
but he was willing to launch missiles for these reasons, but he wasn't willing to accept Syrian refugees.
Yeah.
And so I think there are things that we could be do to helping out on the humanitarian end. Unfortunately, when it comes to military action, I don't see regime change working. I don't see any sort of large-scale military intervention working. There's simply no good answers here.
Yeah, and that's, I think in a lot of ways that almost should be the consensus. If it's not the consensus, it's almost as there's not a good answer, so let it fall the way it's going to fall. Do you feel now that Trump has changed course somewhat? There seems to be a divide in his administration, right? So Rex Tillerson is really saying that, carrying the language of regime change.
Yeah.
Trump is saying we're not going to go much further than this. What do you think? What does that say to you in terms of foreign policy in the Trump administration, number one, but then two, the actual future for Assad in Syria?
Well, it's very hard to make sense of the foreign policy of the Trump administration at the moment. Just because there's so many different actors saying different things, and Trump has taken multiple positions on
everything.
Everything, yes. But if I had to guess, I don't think that they're going to pursue regime change in Syria. I think he does want to remain limited there.
Okay.
I think the Tomahawk strike was an effort to send a signal, but he doesn't want to go that much beyond that. Hopefully, it won't, lead to a situation that spirals out of control and he feels compelled to escalate. But my guess would be that they'll probably continue with what's been going on and ultimately not try to overthrow Assad.
Okay, so let's take a step back to the entire concept of regime change and back to your research. In the 66 examples of regime change, 40 of which have failed. I'm going to keep repeating that as loudly as I can. Have they all? What format of regime change did they come in? Did they come in replacing the entire government, replacing the leader, replacing a combination? What did you find?
Yeah, you see both of them. I can't remember the exact numbers, but I think about 70% of them was just changing the leadership, and the other 30% was actually trying to change the form of government.
Okay.
Which is roughly equal to what overt cases are as well. Yeah, so that's the variety. As for what type of form these interventions take, I say there's 5 main tactics. There's assassinations, sponsoring coup d'etats, rigging and trying to influence foreign elections, supporting foreign dissident groups in their bids to topple a government, and trying to have democratic revolutions in an authoritarian state.
We have a diverse set of tools that
Yes.
that we employ. I hate to laugh about it, but it's almost, you become jaded with it after a while, which actually is something I do want to ask you. And again, anything I ask you that you don't want to answer, feel free not to answer. But how do you reconcile America's legacy and the footprint that we've left in the different regions, the turmoil that we've left in the name of regime change? How do you reconcile that with any positive feelings that you may have for the United States? It's a big one.
That's a big one. Well, I should say that not all regime change are bad. You could look at, the interventions in Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan post-World War II. We turned two of the worst regimes in history into stable democracies that are our closest allies. Even with the covert cases, there have been some better examples supporting solidarity in Poland in the 1980s.
Okay.
So you can look at those cases.
That's like 5 cases.
That's true.
I'm sorry, I don't mean
Yeah.
to do that to you. But and the reason I ask is because, it's very difficult to look at our history, our assorted mix of interventions and failed interventions, and the body trail that we've left in the name of regime change and spreading democracy. I mean, hell, you could just stop right back at Iraq, right? And the destabilized region that we created in that. It's very hard to reconcile that with any notion of the United States being a noble actor on the world stage. Do you not try to view it through that lens and view it through more of an academic lens that America is just like any other nation doing what they feel is in their best interest? How does that play out for you?
Well, from an academic perspective, I think you're right. I think the United States acts in its national interest just as other states act in their national interest, and that the United States isn't, abnormal in that regard. But as a person, I'm still an American, and so it's hard not to take a normative stance on a lot of these things.
It is.
And have strong opinions about it.
I find myself struggling with that on a regular basis. I'm sure my audience is like, they would love for me to jump on the side of anti-imperialism, America's evil, and I'm like, let's talk a little bit about international relations theory in this broader context, because this is my take, and as a professor, please correct me, because I've just had my master's. I didn't finish my dissertation. I'm a bum. But from my perspective, we have a tendency to have empires, whether you call it just a hegemony or an empire. This is sort of what the world order leans to and throughout world history. And so even though we may be very opposed to what America is doing, do you feel like any other actor would do anything differently?
Well, I think any actor that, if it were as powerful as the United States in its region or as powerful as the United States in the world, would try to remake its
Empower.
region in its image. I don't think the U.S. is abnormal in that regard. I think we are abnormal in that we're the only state to become as powerful as we have on the world stage, obviously. But as other states rise, like China, they'll be trying to revise the international system in their favor.
How much revision do you think they are interested in? That's just the whole. I mean, you said a lot there, right? There's only so much revision that America would allow before it actually causes conflict. How much revision do you think? This is just the freebie. Do you think China is interested in?
I think right now they're relatively content because they're rising in an American-led order. The change they want is around the margins, and in terms of territory or anything like that. Obviously, they're interested in the South China Sea. They're interested in Taiwan. But I wouldn't expect any sort of major challenges to the U.S.-led order just yet. In 50 years, when they're more powerful,
You never know.
yeah.
Yeah, you never know. We talked about China, just obviously on the fringes there. North Korea, and the relationship with China, what's happening with actually, you know what? Before I even go there, you really have given us the answer across the board, right? The data is saying don't. When you think about regime change, if you're feeling like regime change might be a solution in North Korea, every situation is dynamic, but the data is telling us don't.
Yeah.
I don't really know if this, I mean, there's probably 101 questions that I could ask you about this just in all of your different fields. But we're really stuck at an impasse where on the international stage, here's the question. This is what I would want to ask you. How do we communicate this? How do we communicate this to our leaders? How do we communicate this, especially when if you discuss the things that we're discussing here, you're derided as being an apologist. You're considered an Assad apologist. I don't know if you've run into that yet, but publish this article, and I'm quite sure you will. How do you even wade into that? And if so, how do you recommend that we communicate this?
Yes, I have been called an apologist, bringing up the very fact that the U.S. does these covert regime change attempts. People haven't liked that. But the facts are what they are. I think the way to communicate it to the political leaders is, if you look at Trump, a lot of his appeal was that he was non-interventionist when it came to the foreign policy. Also, Bernie Sanders, strongly anti-regime change, oddly enough to compare those two people. But one thing that really resonated with a lot of people was just that people have had enough of regime change. They've had enough of these wars. I think a lot of people have come to recognize the fundamental limits to American power and, want a less interventionist foreign policy. So I think there is more of an understanding there. If you go back in time, you look back pre-Iraq War, 70% of the population approved it. Yeah. Now I think, there's much smaller numbers that would be in favor of regime change, and hopefully the politicians will.
Absolutely. So, you know what? I think this is a good spot. I want to continue the conversation. I know we probably have callers lined up, and there's questions all in the chat room. But there's so many questions there. I don't know if I could really pull any of them out from here. But I'll say this. Let's, if you have any questions, if you want to join the conversation, which I hate that phrase, but it's still stuck in my head, 857-600-0518. We've been joined by Professor O'Rourke from Boston College. We're discussing regime change, the folly of regime change, a fool's errand. When is that article coming out? And I know it's an academic piece.
It's out for review, so it depends on whether it gets accepted.
Yeah. So that's a process. Any guesstimates, or is there really no way to tell?
If it gets accepted, probably, within 5 or 6 months,
Okay.
if not.
Oh man, the timing is perfect for now. But that's the conversation we're having. I want to know your questions. What would you like for me to ask the professor on this topic? I know this is a topic that's really heated in our circles and what we discuss. A lot of what you've said, I would be honest with you, just hearing you talk, I can't say that it really changed my perspective. I've really had a very ambivalent relationship with this idea of regime change. And you've given a few examples of when it turned out good and when it was for the good. But you really have this, or I really have this hesitation with regard to this, but then you're stuck in situations like North Korea. You're stuck with situations like Syria. And there feels like there's this compelling force to say, do something. And but doing something in these cases really is undermining the best interest of everyone involved, including the United States. Here's the question that someone just dropped into our chat room here is, have you found in any examples of regime change in the name of humanitarianism that was really just something else?
Well, I think the recent example of the intervention in Libya in 2011, it's often sold as a humanitarian intervention. I think that case was oversold, that they went beyond merely protecting civilians pretty quickly, and it was regime change from the beginning. Unfortunately, as in Libya, as happens in most cases, they intervene, even somewhat for humanitarian reasons, but ultimately it had precisely the opposite effect.
Right.
Libya broke out into a civil war. There's probably more mass killing now than there would have been had the U.S. not intervened and not given weapons to the rebels. Those weapons have now been showing up in neighboring states. So it's just very hard to improve the situation on the ground for civilians with regime change. There are a couple of examples in history. Vietnam in 1979 intervened into Cambodia throughout the Khmer Rouge that had been committing a genocide. Tanzania's intervention in Uganda to overthrow Idi Amin the same year. Both, brought undeniably brutal regimes, threw them out. Unfortunately, both of them led to further fighting and counterinsurgency that claimed tens of thousands of lives.
Right.
So it's just very hard to find an example of it working out.
So in your, just your estimation, and maybe not necessarily your opinion, but your observation, it seems as though having a strong man, I guess the best example is, I think George H.W. Bush said of Saddam Hussein originally, he may be a son of a bitch, but he's our son of a bitch. Do you feel like that, in certain regions to, one, stay out of it, but then two, having a strong man there who may be a brutal dictator, may not be as bad as what could come afterwards?
Yeah, I think George H.W. Bush's decision not to go to Baghdad in 1981, he got a lot of flack for that, but I think, he laid out the reasons of what would happen. There would be, massive civil strife. We didn't have an exit strategy. There would likely be, further humanitarian problems. And so in those cases, I think there's just nothing the United States can do to try and improve the situation for the people on the ground, unfortunately.
Do you consider yourself a progressive politically, on the political spectrum?
Yes.
How does that sit with your, now I'm asking some, philosophical questions now.
Yeah.
How does that sit with you if you're a progressive who fights for human rights and you find yourself in this position where the best solution is to leave a bastard in power who is antithetical to everything that you believe in human rights, but removing him may open up a can of worms that would be even worse? How do you reconcile that?
I have a lot of cognitive dissonance. I think you have to focus on the things you could do to try and help out the populations.
Because I'm genuinely stuck there. I'm genuinely stuck there with this idea that the best thing that may be for Syria is to leave Assad in power, or to have left Saddam Hussein in power. I firmly believe that at this point, but then it also makes you take a step back and say, well, am I, from my progressive worldview, I'm consigning these people to a life of human rights violations underneath this brutal dictator. And I guess I'm just living with that same cognitive dissonance. I don't have an answer.
Yeah.
I have another unfair question for you, but you're here and you are, you've studied underneath some professors that I have their books in my cabinet right now. So I really respect your opinion and your academic prowess. All right, here's the question finally that I got out of that prelude. The question is this: in terms of a foreign policy that could remotely be considered progressive, everything that we do, everything that's entrenched in the United States, the military-industrial complex, the neoconservatism, the brutal way that we carry out regimes historically, carry out campaigns historically, I feel like there's a gaping hole from any alternative views on the bureaucratic level. And then I actually, in my studies, I'm sure you obviously aware of this, is that it didn't seem, maybe I didn't read the right book, but it doesn't seem that there are a lot of alternative worldviews that are a coherent theory to challenge anything that's in Washington, D.C. right now. Where do we start with a robust foreign policy that can be considered progressive, that could actually challenge what's entrenched in D.C.?
Well, I think there are some scholars working on developing grand strategies that, align more with progressive politics. Barry Posen at MIT has a great book, The Case for Restraint, which is
The face of restraint?
the case for
Case for-
restraint.
Okay.
There's other people working sort of on a neo-isolationist bent that, is very skeptical of military intervention. My advisors, you mentioned John Mearsheimer, has a theory of offshore balancing, where you only intervene to prevent the rise of a peer competitor in geostrategically important places, which would, significantly decrease when the United States would intervene militarily. So I think there are some people there.
Okay.
Their ideas don't resonate very much in Washington. I think a lot of people in Washington have a very optimistic idea that we can do something and that we can solve these problems. It's just a matter of finding the right military instrument. And it's hard to say in these cases, people like Assad, that maybe doing nothing is the best course of action.
It's interesting that you put that that vantage point on the people in D.C. that they want to solve a problem. It makes it seem like they're almost benevolent in some ways. It depends on what time of the day it is. I view them through the lens of not being so benevolent, to say the least. Do you feel as though they would be? No, let me start that question over again. Why do you feel like there's benevolence? It seems more of they have a worldview, they have theories that they can depend on, at least intellectually. They believe they can depend on it. They know if they send the troops in, they're going to get X, Y, Z as a result, or at least they believe they're going to get that. So to me, it feels like they're just falling back on what they know more so than any level of benevolence.
Maybe benevolence isn't the right word, maybe just self-interest. They think that there's a problem or there's something they can get from this country, and they think that, military intervention is the best way to achieve that. And oftentimes, that the evidence doesn't indicate that that's the case.
Absolutely. Listen, as you can see, I could probably think of at least 1,000 other questions. I might just see if I can come audit one of your classes at Boston
Absolutely,
College.
anytime.
Thanks so much for joining us. Tell everyone the best way. Are you? I hope you're not, but are you on Twitter or anything?
I'm not. No.
Good. That's the best answer. Stay away from Twitter. But if anyone wants to follow up on your research, what's the best way for them to find your research?
Just Google me, or the Boston College Political Science Department website has a link to my personal webpage.
Awesome. We have been joined tonight by Lindsey O'Rourke from Boston College, professor of political science with the emphasis on international relations, international security, foreign policy, and regime change. And I am definitely looking forward to your article when it comes out.
Thank you very much for having me.
My
It's been a
pleasure. 857-600-0518. I want to know what you think. We only have a few more minutes here, but obviously we want to get you in on the conversation. Okay, thanks. And actually, I'm sorry, just taking a look at that. All right. Actually, you know what? What do you think? What do you think, Max? Good places any? Get the weekend started early? You guess? Good night, folks. See you later.
The Benjamin Dixon Show is only possible with listener support. Go to www.thebenjamindixonshow.com to register for our blog, join the Progressive Army, and support The Benjamin Dixon Show. It's Ben Dixon! If you like this episode, be sure to share, like, and subscribe.
Consider becoming a Patreon. Go to www.patreon.com/The BPD Show and support The Benjamin Dixon Show.